sharing our stories connects us. Listen and be connected. Join us for the conversation meeting weekly at the intersection of community and culture. Hosted by Mario Nunez and Joe King Carter. And today's show is going to prove to be one of our best yet. We are just so excited to be coming at you here Wednesday, hump day in the middle of the middle of the week, middle of the day. Does it get any more humpier than that, Joe?
At the tippy top of the hump.
After the show, it's all downhill. We're racing towards the weekend. Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in. This is WMNF Tampa. We are The Conversation. My name is Mario Nunez, and you've already heard from Joe King Carter.
Good afternoon.
Hey, Joey. Anything happened this weekend that might be of note, that might be front of mind?
Woo! You mean like a sitting president in his first term deciding not to run, and a woman of color deciding to run as candidate? Are you talking about that moment in history? Yeah.
I mean,
it's good stuff.
These are unprecedented times and historic times, and if you're not leaning in and paying attention, especially to the younger listeners, and you know, you and I, we've been around the block a minute or two, Joey.
I went around it a few more times than you have.
Yes, sir. Yeah. Yes, sir. And so I'm just saying, pay attention, y'all, because this is something that will be written about in the history books. Just like Washington crossing the Potomac, those early historical moments that make a definitive mark on the timeline. This is one of those.
Well, we're all of us are always marching to the parade of history every day.
Correct.
But it is interesting when you can look back and remember JFK or somebody like that, like I can. So yeah, it is historical. It's a historical moment of great significance, I believe.
One of those where they ask you always, where were you? And you knew exactly where you were when you heard the news.
Absolutely.
Right. So yes, we're moving in a new direction. We are. I think hope is alive. You know what I mean? It's like, your team was chasing, a defeat. Yeah. And all of a sudden, miraculously, you recovered a fumble. And now you've got an opportunity to score and maybe even win in the last few seconds of the game. So it's a sprint. Put your tennis shoes on, stay hydrated, get your headband, your wristbands on, and let's get ready to go to work.
New energy is afoot, and I like it.
I do too. All right, so there it is. There's your PSA for the day. Thank you again, everybody, for listening. We've got a great show lined up for you today. Joe, our dear friend Sarah McNamara is in studio with us today. We know her, we love her, but maybe some of our audience members haven't had the opportunity to know about her. Give us a little background.
I hope we're going to get to know her a little more in this hour. She's Dr. Sarah McNamara.
Thank you.
I have to tell you that as a person who is a lay historian in Ybor City, I can't say enough lays in front of her because she's truly an academician of the highest level. I'm sort of starstruck because what Sarah has done recently in the publishing of her book, Ybor City, The Crucible of Latina South, has opened up a whole new vista for those of us who are studiers of history in Ybor City and students of history. And, there's only so many books out there about Ybor City. And if you're like me, you've read every one of them. And some of them are great. But when we don't have somebody publishing a new vision of our history, a new way of seeing it every day. So it's a great thing. But before we get to that, we need to get to Sarah. So let's say...
Hi, Sarah.
Hi, Sarah.
Hi, everyone. How are you doing? Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming in. We know how busy your schedule is, and we know that you drove down from Gainesville where you're doing research for another project just to be with us today. We saw you in your seat just before getting a little respite, just before we went on the air, but lights are on, energy up, and here we go. Tell us what you've been doing of late.
Oof. So lately, since the book came out, it has been quite the year. The book came out, I wanted to launch it locally in Tampa, and that was the primary focus of what I did upon its publication. So I did a lot of work in Ybor last summer, which was a ton of fun. Launched a mural and marker project with Michelle Sawyer, who is a muralist and a dear friend of mine down here and locally. Then did a series of programming from different art exhibits to photo exhibits to talks to speaking about radicalism to women's history to Latina history to Latinx history to giving tours, making sure that the message of the book was able to reach community. And I was really excited by the reaction to it, because when you write a book, you never know how it will land. But then after that, the other part of my job started, which was connecting the book nationally. So for the last year, I have been traveling almost nonstop, giving talks at different universities, going to bookstores, connecting with people who are beyond Florida. Because one of my goals in writing the book and the way that I look at history is that when we think about histories of Florida and when we think about histories of Tampa especially, that it oftentimes remains so localized. And I wanted to launch Ybor City and to share the message of what it was with a broader, more national audience. So as I wrote the book, asking questions of what does this story mean in terms of significance, not just what can we relate to locally, figuring out a way that I can branch those two things was really important. So I love that Ybor City is assigned in California. It's assigned in the Midwest. It is on graduate curriculum, the way that people are thinking about what the nation is. And those who
that's wonderful.
Intellectualize it are connected to this book in different ways. So that's an exciting byproduct, but it's also a really exhausting schedule.
I'm sure.
Because I also have a full-time job. So.
Yeah, right. And what might that full-time job be? Remind our audience.
I'm a professor, so I'm a historian. I work at Texas A&M University,
Go
where
Aggies.
I'm a member of the where I'm a member of the history department, and I'm also core faculty in Latinx and Mexican American studies. I also work with the Race and Ethnic Studies Institute at the university. So in that capacity, I teach. I teach a few classes a year. And I do a lot of service. I work for different historical institutions, and the major part of my job, which is doing research.
Have you found, Sarah, that in your travels, that the subject matter is resonating with a certain region of the country more so than others? Are we talking about areas of the country that we know have larger Latino populations? Is that something that you've connected?
In some ways. So one of the things that I was rather intentional about when I wrote the book was that was how I framed it. I wanted it to intersect urban history, women's history, Latino history. I wanted it to be in these different avenues. So as a result of that, it has received attention in a wide variety of capacities. And, I'm excited when I hear that people who love urban history are reading the book, or those who do immigration and ethnic history are reading the book. Those in, Latinx studies, those were, that was my built-in audience. I knew that they were coming for it. But one of at least when we think about the landscape of academia, we all read everything. So I read histories of, Latinxes in the Midwest. I read histories of what's going on in California, in New York. One area of the country that is severely understudied is the South, with the exception of Texas. So histories of the South, especially in terms of Latinidad, is severely understudied. So there are 5 people nationally who study the region. One, being myself, writing about Florida. A good friend of mine, his name is Julio Capó. He writes about Miami. Another good friend of mine, Cecilia Marquez. She just had a book come out called Latino South, and hers looks at 5 different southern states. There is a young assistant professor at Emory who writes about Atlanta. And then there's also work on indigenous history in North Carolina migration patterns by a friend of mine named Yuri Ramirez, who is at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. So we are all located across the country, but it's a very small group who are doing that work.
Can we get in on that group chat? We
it's an exciting group chat.
I imagine that it is.
Yeah, I mean, it's an exhausting group chat, but that's one of the things, right? When there's so few people who study one topic, when a book does come out about it, people do know, especially, within a scholarly community.
And you celebrate each other's successes because you're all in the same pools trying to get the same message out. If you're just joining us, this is The Conversation, and we're talking with Sarah McNamara, who has authored a book called Ybor City Crucible of the Latina South. It is fascinating, but let's take a moment and step back and
Yes.
connect you to Ybor City. Let's talk a little bit of history.
Yeah, let's talk a little
Family.
about your family and your
Familial.
connection
Sure.
to Tampa and
You want to
Ybor.
know me beyond my job?
Yes. Yes.
Sure.
So,
Yep.
talk a little bit about where you grew up, who your family is, your connections to Ybor City, whatever you want to talk about.
Sure. So I am from Tampa, Florida. My mom's family is from Ybor City, and I grew up here. I was born in Tampa, and growing up, it was my grandmother who she had a really formative role in my life. The way that I write about her in the book, because I do weave family in different ways, is that she always wanted my sister and I to remember what it meant to be of and from Ybor. And to her, that had a specific meaning. But to me, as a historian, the meaning that held changed over time, especially when it came to understanding and contending with yourself, the decisions that the community has made, and what effect that has had on the broader landscape of Tampa, I think is really important. Because the history of Ybor City is not just a history of Latinidad within the community. It's also a history of how do people who were marginalized, who had to navigate things that were difficult, that included issues of clan violence or issues of white supremacy, come to make decisions that really can marginalize other people at the expense of themselves. So when we think about what Tampa looks like, many of those decisions are a product of that. And if we think about ourselves in relationship to history, we're also always trying to figure out who we are and what that means. And one thing that I tell my students is making a hero out of anyone will always disappoint you, because everyone is human. And even when we're looking at our own communities, remembering that's really important. So to my grandmother, she wanted me to remember things that were, what were the foodways that made Ybor City? What were the places where we should go? The jewelry store that used to be down on 7th Avenue, I think now where the 7-Eleven is, where she believed that if I got my...
La Otoma.
Yeah, if I got my earrings from
Julio Mexicano.
yeah, if I got my earrings from there, I wouldn't lose them, which was totally incorrect. I lost earrings all the time, but we were great customers at that store. But at a young age, she got me involved with the Ybor City Museum Society. She was one of the early docents who began working there when the museum opened in the 1980s, and she and the other women who worked there, they had kind of an alternative tour that they would give, because they felt like the script that had been developed didn't represent.
Wasn't enough.
what
Didn't quite
they
get there,
knew.
yeah.
Right.
Yeah, they, especially when
was their
you
lived
talked about
experience.
walking in the casitas, right? So that certain things were identified that to them were identified incorrectly, or what were different spaces used for in different ways, or what were the variety of problems that they, experienced. So they would teach their grandchildren and, have us give tours with them.
They went rogue.
I read
They did go
somewhere.
rogue.
I read somewhere in your bio that you, or in one of the stories I read, that you were a teen guide for the museum. Is that what you're kind of referring to?
I guess so. Yes. So I was a teenager. I went to Hillsborough High School, which was where
Go Terriers.
Yeah, go Terriers.
Go Big Red.
My whole family has gone to Hillsborough. So from anyone who's finished high school, right? So from my grandparents to my mom and
How lucky. You have
myself
that-
and my sister.
that history is wonderful.
We are all Hillsborough High School graduates. My sister and I were part of the IB program. And one of the requirements of that is that you have to do a certain number of community hours. So that was how I became involved in the teen program. As
So-
soon as I said it, she's like, I have a job for you. I was like, I shouldn't have said it
Thanks,
out loud.
Abuela, thanks.
Here we go.
So that leads me to a question I was thinking about earlier, which now you're sort of answering in process, is, how does a teenager, how does a young woman who's 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 years old sort of become a historian? I mean, this is not an occupation that people are thinking a lot about in high school typically. Did you sort of evolve into history as a favorite subject, or did you at some moment in time said, I want to be a historian?
I always enjoyed learning history. It was a subject that I was drawn to and that I really enjoyed. I don't know that I understood why I loved it when I was younger. When I went to undergrad, I thought that I wanted to be a lawyer. I wanted to be an immigration lawyer. I wanted to center on assisting immigration policy and changing, especially that sector of society in a positive way. it wasn't until I took a pre-law class that I realized that there was something about history that I thought was particularly important, or that was important to my own self-fulfillment. And that was that I really loved writing. To me, the portion in taking a pre-law class that I didn't love was that I felt like the personality that and the form that you can tell a story or relate to a person via writing. I learned how important that was to me when I was learning how to brief cases, or what would that look like. And I started to think, how can advocacy operate? What does telling the past do? And as I started to professionalize, especially in undergrad, the way that I thought about history, I started to think about that many of the processes that we find constraining today are things that can be undone, right? So ideas of racial inequality are things that are not necessarily inherent to any person, but they certainly are inherent to how societies are built. But if it is something that can be built, then it's also something that can be deconstructed if we are willing to understand the world that we all live in. And if we're willing to do something that's really brave and construct the processes that we're all a part of and that we're all complicit to in different forms. That's what history can do, not just in terms of questions of histories of racism, but also in terms of urban planning, in terms of gender, in terms of sexism, in terms of these different topics. Because at its core, when we're telling stories, you're also telling stories of humanity. And that's what history can do. It can look at the past, tell us how we got here, and break it down for us, at least if we're willing to do that.
And I think it's just fascinating to me when you consider the fact that you might have come to this conclusion at such an early age. Now, you said about briefing, so you're already in college, you're already studying, maybe taking some classes in pre-law to understand how you can better use your inherent talents.
I was like a junior in college.
Yeah. Which is about the right age when you would make a decision like that. Listen, if you'd like to get into the conversation, well, that's a great name for a radio show. If you'd like to get into the conversation with Sarah McNamara, please join us. You can call us at 813-239-9663. You can always send a text, 813-433-0885. Emails work as well, dj@wmnf.org. And we got a caller already. Sarah, would you like to see what this caller has to say, and then we can bring them in on the conversation? Maybe they have something interesting they'd like to include. Caller, you're on the air. David, are you there?
Yeah, hey, this is actually David, Mr. White Pepper Bryant from the Soul Kitchen.
Oh, hey, David. Thanks for calling.
Hey, David.
Thank you. Hi. And I love the idea of the Ybor City book. I'll definitely have to check it out. And I was curious if she wrote about the Silver Ring, which was kind of like a famous Cuban sandwich shop that's unfortunately no longer there, but had reopened in Bartow for a little while, and then it closed again. But that just is kind of a old school, Ybor business that comes to mind when I think of Ybor.
David, I'll tell you what, we're going to take your call and let her answer that. Thank you so much for calling, and we'll be listening tonight, brother. You know we will.
Absolutely.
You know we will. Thank you again, David. So the newest iteration of the Silver Ring is now at West Shore Mall. If David didn't know that, he can get over there. Nelson Valdez, a friend of ours and a friend of the show's, has once again revived the brand. So David, get over to West Shore Mall, the food court, the Silver Ring with the old signage survives. And I think the next book that we can encourage Sarah to write might be something in the culinary field, although I think that's way down the list.
But she must have been a customer at the Silver Ring.
100% her. Well, I must have taken her down to 7th Avenue.
Did you ever go there?
My memory is of El Gallo de Oro by the time that I was younger.
Oh, El Gallo, sure.
Yeah, El Gallo de Oro.
Right there in Tampa Bay, in Armenia.
Yep, right down there. My grandparents lived off of Armenia, like near Armenia and Sly.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so that was the quickie go-to. That and the helado shop that was along the way.
Oh, the helados, of course. Andy's Helados.
So down there in West Time.
Andy's Helados, which those of us longtime Tampa people would remember. Tampeños of a certain age would remember.
Yeah. But
Sarah,
to answer David really quick, I mentioned the Silver Ring in passing in the 4th chapter, what I'm kind of setting the scene of how Ybor City has changed by the time that you get in by the time that you get into the late 40s and 50s. So more in terms of a scene setting. But if you are interested in culinary history, then I would point you to the recent book about Cuban sandwiches in Tampa. But I am not a food historian. I am all about knowing your expertise and staying in your lane. And I'm glad that lights people up, but that is not my not my area of expertise. But I do use a lot of food history when I am
David
writing.
Absolutely has his finger on the pulse. So let's talk a little bit more in depth about Crucible of the Latina South and the time period that you are depicting here, which I think has correlations to today in a lot of ways, right? So,
it does.
And people don't understand that Ybor City was this bubbling cauldron, crucible, if you will, of political activity, and it was quite a hot zone for not only commerce but for a lot of things.
It was. So my book, it's broken into 4 different chapters. So it actually took me a really long time to figure out how I wanted to tell the story. The introduction and the conclusion blend family and memory and what all those things mean. So the introduction, right, is as I'm trying to work through that and what it means looking for family. And the conclusion, I call it, finding, when I find what all of this means. But in between, I wanted to be able to tell a story, both of people, of their politics, how they evolve over time, as well as how that happens alongside the city. So the chapters align, they're building, resisting, surviving, remaking. The entire trajectory of the book, it moves from the 1880s. So from building this community, what it was built for, how it was received. So building Ybor City, Ybor being a space that was built and conceptualized as a place that could be controlled, that was intended to control labor. But the reality ends up being how uncontrollable that labor was. It's so you can't have a Cuban cigar without having people who knew how to roll Cuban cigars. And the hand-rolled process at the time was such a premium that employing people who had learned this specific method was important. And they also protected it via the union. Because when Vicente Martinez Ybor came and said that he wanted to assist and develop this here, those who were the head and, Tampa power holders, what they thought was that this was going to bring jobs to the other 700 people who lived here. But those who were Cubans who came were not willing to train. Right?
Not
people
so fast.
Who were not
so fast.
Yeah, right.
Were very protective of their industry and of the culture surrounding it, and especially of the workplaces. So the end product was impossible without that particular expertise, without the apprenticeship, and without those people. And they were willing to walk away, which was the most important part, right? They had unions and they were willing to walk away. And they were willing to walk away not just because of what happened on the shop room floor, but they were willing to walk away if you didn't build a bridge. They were willing to walk away if you didn't extend electrical grids. They were willing to walk away for so many things because they knew the economic power that they held, and Tampa couldn't survive with them. That created a very particular environment through the 1920s, right? By the time you get to the 1930s, the resisting portion, which I think is the element of the book that reminds people most of today, you're living in a very different environment. The Cuban cigar industry is no longer the economic backbone of the state, and its influence is waning every single day, right? Why is somebody going to buy a high-priced cigar in the middle of the Great Depression when they can hardly afford to pay their rent? That is a reality that happens nationwide. There's also more competition from cigarette companies at the same time, right? So between affordability and what is the cost benefit of something that is a luxury product is something that people are creating an equation of during this period of time. So companies like Lucky Strike, you see them soar, and you see things like El Príncipe de Galles, right, begin to fall simultaneously. But that also means that laborers have less influence. The power that that particular kind of labor held has less importance. It means that people need assistance in order to continue to live, right? Like many other people did during the Great Depression. And who you are, who has access to those things becomes really important. So during the 1930s, one of the things that happens globally is that the Spanish Civil War emerges. The Spanish Civil War emerges in 1936, and it is a question of fascism versus democratic rule, right, that centers in Spain. But while this conflict happens in Spain, it ends up being an international galvanizing conflict. And it's something that galvanizes Ybor City and galvanizes those who saw themselves as experiencing intense inequity, both from the localized governments as well as from how they were treated by vigilante forces, right? Because when we're talking about Ybor, things like the Klan, they were not conceptual, they were very real. It's so the form of politics that emerges in the 50s is from people who had very close relationships to what these power dynamics meant. So in the 1930s, what people begin to do is that they are in Tampa, is that they create a Republican committee where they are supporting the which was a democratically elected Republican government in Spain. That government was pro-union. It was there was mass women's leadership in it. It sought to shift the way that the economy worked, and it was the fascist government of Franco who contended it. So they in Tampa. In Ybor City specifically, they create the Republican committee that operates as a fundraising committee. People would give 1 day of their labor pay to support it, and over time, I mean, they
what was that referred to as, Sarah? Well, that had a certain name, did it not?
The giving 1 day. I guess you want to tell me?
Well, I thought it was un día para la patria, no, or something, but there was a
Dia Patria, wasn't it? Not.
That's what I thought it was.
Patria?
Yeah, it was.
Or was that earlier with?
I mean, that would, to me,
Jose
relate
Marti.
to the independence movement. They give 1 day. They give 1
So
day
they
of
were
pay at
accustomed-
different portions.
I got you.
Time. Right. So that's one portion that I make a big deal of in the book is that the history of the moments when they give that money, it changes over time. So in the 1880s, they're doing the same thing, but they're doing it for the Cuban independence movement.
Right.
They do it for union-based movements in the early 1900s to the 1920s. They do it again in the 1930s as they're countering fascism.
Anti-fascist.
And while
Antifa.
we, talk about the different relationship that Tampa has to Castro or to Cuba, the one time when that doesn't happen is the 1950s. Right. So while we think about this continuity, there are also things that break from it. Right. One thing that makes where you have sympathy, where you have ambient support, but you don't have the same money supporting or money making efforts in the same way. So in a way, you can see generational change in those kinds of shifts. In a way, you can also see that the cigar industry is not as powerful as it once was. In a way, you can see what happens when right to work legislation happens, right? There are all these other things that you can see. There's all different forms to explain it, but that people's relationship also shifts over time as generation change. So the Dia de la Patria, right, that would be in connection to the independence movement, but that wouldn't necessarily be to the Spanish Civil War in the same way.
Got you.
Connected to Cuba
But-
Libre.
Right. It is the Spanish Civil War would be connected to the Spanish
Right.
Republican government,
Right,
whereas
right.
Cuba Libre would be talking about a Cuba for Cubans, both connecting the independence movement as well as Castro's
And I would think
tagline.
I would think it would also be like an issue for the workers as well to put included in their daily activities. Like if the cafetero doesn't come around with the coffee, I think we'll walk off the job for that as well, because these people knew their worth before things started to decline. In the 30s, you were talking about 36 when all of the anti-fascist movement
Yes.
started.
Yes.
That was a time of also resurgence of sense of purpose, right? But the men weren't necessarily taking the lead because they couldn't. According to
No.
our friend Sarah McNamara, the women had to lean in here because the men had to keep their heads down.
They did. So by 1936, there's been a massive change in the cigar industry. You can see it if you look at those old Burgert Brothers images, right, that are
Absolutely.
available through HCPL and also available through the USS Special Collections. If you look at those early images, you'll see shop room floors that are covered with men, right? Men are the predominant workers. If you go through a little slideshow and you watch it over time, who is doing that labor changes? And that massive labor change happens in 1931. In 1931, there's a strike that occurs in protest of removing the lector, and the result is that many Cuban cigar manufacturers, they fire in mass men and they hire back women. Women during the 1930s, and perhaps we can talk about today, were cheaper.
Right.
Were cheaper to have employed to do the exact same labor that men were
So
doing.
that's where it all started.
That's it.
Oh, I mean, going back.
Going way
Even-
back.
Way
Yeah.
back. I mean, before that, they were looking, despaliadores in the basement prior to that. So, right, definitely having a raise in terms of the caliber and the respect of the kind of work they were doing, which also meant that they wielded different political power. Within Ybor City, all of a sudden, you had a largely employed Latina workforce, and you had a
Correct.
largely unemployed Latino workforce. So women become advocates within union. It changes who is representing the union. They bring union organizers down from New York to lead the AFL-CIO because they do not believe that women will join.
And if I may, I would assume it's changing power dynamics in families because the woman might be the wage earner in that family.
They typically were the primary wage earner,
Right,
and
exactly,
men were
yeah.
unemployed. They were either working in box factories or trying to work for the WPA. But this is where, elements of anti-fascism also come in, is that Latinos were having a hard time getting jobs via the WPA. So even though the WPA did not necessarily operate based off of what somebody's ethnic or racial background was, it certainly did by who was running the WPA board. So Latinos were less likely to get those positions. In general, I think that people in Ybor City identified as fascist. It ranged from what happened when you tried to speak out against any inequity, which would be vigilante violence or direct violence through, at the time, the police department, the regulating of the different types of political ideologies that people had, as well as the type of work availability that people from Ybor had access to, from jobs within the broader market, as well as to WPA assistance. Putting all those things together with a longer history, they saw the actions that the city of Tampa advocated during that period of time, or the governing entities, as fascist. That's how they identified it. So much like communities in other areas of the nation, they made a link between what they called fascism at home and fascism abroad.
Right.
So their organizing was part of what was called a People's Front, the Frente Popular, or the Popular Front, where they were part of a global coalition that sought to overthrow fascism and act as a sense of resistance. So they gave their money, they gave their power, they gave their organizing. And one of the high points in the second chapter is this moment when roughly 5,000 to 7,000 women, depending on which record you're looking at, marched from downtown Ybor City to the front steps
An
of
amazing
City Hall
moment.
in protest
Amazing.
of these exact things.
There's an image in the book. There's an image in the book.
There is.
And may I take a moment? I feel like I want to do this. I want to read something here very quickly on air. These are Sarah's words. What is impressive about the Ybor City community, however, is that they did not stop striking. They did not stop organizing. They did not stop living. While Anglos in Tampa sought to control and rebuke authority that immigrants and U.S.-born cigar workers had held over their workplace and their neighborhood, the people of Ybor fought back. Unionism remained strong, as did leftist political activism. Over time, the community looked for solutions and tactics to bypass violence and often found the solution in women. I think I love that paragraph.
Somewhat prescient for the discussions we're having in these days.
Yeah, but it's this is what I was talking about at the beginning of the show when I said that Sarah has opened up a vista, is that I was not aware of this because I had not read it anywhere. Mm-hmm. Right. And now I'm. This has all been incorporated. So go ahead. I'm sorry, I didn't.
No. You're totally
If you're just joining us now, we want to play something for you that we've pre-recorded. Hit that button.
Hi, y'all, and I'm Diana Durango. You're listening to The Conversation with Mario Nunez and Joe King Carter on WMNF Community Radio 88.5 Tampa.
We just wanted to get that out there. It
That's
sounds
nice.
so good. It's just like a little palate cleanser.
Hi, y'all.
But we're talking today with Sarah McNamara, and she's digging deep now. Now she's giving us the I guess the jewel in the middle of all the research. Ybor City, Crucible of the Latina South is the name of the title of the book. Encourage everybody to read it, especially if you're interested in Ybor City history. A lot of us are. Mm-hmm. Sarah, it's now 1936-37. Women are marching in the streets.
Yes.
They're organized. They're a fierce opponent. They're not to be messed with.
And this is also to some degree galvanized by Guernica.
Guernica, yeah. So the bombing of Guernica, which brings together the German Luftwaffe, right, as the Nazis have come to power in Germany. The way that I explain the Spanish Civil War to my students is I talk about it as the dress rehearsal to World War II. Mm-hmm. The exact same, with the exception of Japan, right? You have the making of the same ideologies as well as the same major players who are going to be the Axis powers as we emerge into World War II, or as time moves by in World War II. And I mean, that's also an important facet for Ybor City, because Ybor City and those within it, if you're looking at La Gaceta and the things that people are saying, are very much understanding World War II through the lens of an extension of the conflict against fascism that they believed and that they felt sincerely that they were fighting in the 1930s.
Ybor City's sons lined up to wear the uniform. I mean, there was no hesitation. It may have been that because some of them needed employment opportunities and there wasn't an opportunity for them here locally, but we provided a lot of manpower in this area for World War II and the war effort.
Mm-hmm. Yep, many people did. So we're looking at 1936, it is the bombing of Guernica. And so women they galvanize, they begin to march. At first, it is in part a funeral march, which is the idea behind it, right? So women are dressed in black. They are arm in arm. They're in rows of 4, right? So it's a very long procession. It's not a necessarily quick procession that goes from Ybor City to the front steps of City Hall, where they meet the mayor and where they deliver an address of what their demands are, right? Which is basically asking the president to communicate to the president of the United States that they wish for the United States to take a stance on this issue.
Let me just quickly imagine, folks, that what we are saying, what Sarah is saying, is that the number is 5 to 7,000, 5,000?
La Gaceta reports 7 and the Tampa Tribune reports 5.
Okay. So to imagine 5,000 or more Latinas lined up on 7th Avenue. Just try to imagine that image, which there is, fortunately, a photograph of that image. But imagine that, the organizational effort, the passion that these people felt, that these women felt, that the desire to elicit change politically, that they would march, is something that would be, if it happened today, we would be stunned by it. Go ahead.
Would be.
I'm assuming they were stunned back then as well.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure they were stunned, but it's really an amazing moment because I've done political, with my neighborhood association over the years, done political work. It's hard to get 25 people before city council on a subject, on a topic that they feel strongly about.
Correct.
Because you get 25, there's 200 that say they'll be there, but only 25 show up, and then even then it's hard to do. I'm just trying to fathoming the impetus of this and the power of all this. It's really
and how did they do
moment.
it? Because we have cell phones and we have group chats. We were talking about it earlier. How did they get the word out? How did they they meet at the hall, the union halls? What was the mechanism by which they were able to organize?
They had the Republican committee, so it was called La Retrogaria de Tampa. But they also, the main thing is the union, right? The power of union and the power of union organizing. That is one element that doesn't exist in the same way today that it once did. And in many ways, it's not, that surprising that it doesn't exist because it was incredibly powerful and it was incredibly effective. If there is one thing that the history of unionism and labor in Ybor City teaches us nationally, is that in Ybor City, one thing that they were doing was blending demands of labor with demands of politics. Those things were not necessarily separate. They were definitely united, and they were one and the same. Because while you can change your workplace, you can't necessarily guarantee that those workplace-based changes remain in effect without political change. But the reverse lesson is that if you enact political policy that can curb labor, you can at the same time curb political action, and you can also curb the way that labor operates, especially if, depending on what kind of influence, somebody wishes to exert in different forms. So that is what happened. I mean, Florida is such an interesting example. You have Senator
Another
Culpepper,
right-to-work state.
It becomes one of the first right-to-work states.
Correct.
The first. Senator Culpepper, who was at the time a liberal senator, is such an amazing figure to examine. I mean, he is going before before national boards. He is testifying in the Senate. He is talking about inculcating policies that would protect workers in specific ways. And when you look at the histories and you look at the files of the onslaught that he experienced thereafter, I mean, it is intense. Speaking up and in support of those policies really led into the 1950s into anti-communism, right? And ideas or, accusations of communism being not necessarily even based in what political policy is, but it coming to have a meaning in Florida and in the South and even nationally of it being a statement that this is just not the norm, right? Or this is not those who are in power.
So for those that are leaning into the radio and listening to this incredible class that we're getting a master class right about now on organized labor and what things were happening in the South, which people automatically default to unions being a stronghold in the North and the Rust Belt. You think of your Clevelands, your Chicagos, your New York, certainly. But this was all happening in the Deep South at the turn of the century. And, of course, by the 30s, it reached its zenith. But speak to us a little bit. How was this movement here being received up north, where the unions were up north? Favorably, with aplomb? Were they supporting it?
So yes, absolutely supporting it. And they definitely wanted people who were in the South to be members of different unions, right? So the American Federation of Labor was the parent organization of the Cigar Makers International Union, the CMIU. The CMIU was the extension and the major organizer in the state of Florida. And that is in part because of state-based legislation that outlawed things like the TWIU, right? The Tobacco Workers International Union, which was associated with the Congress of Industrial Organizations. This is probably more information than anybody wants to know. Which was connected
we like to get into the weeds here. We don't mind.
Which was connected to farther left-based organizing. The state of Florida outlaws the TWIU, so people come to rely on the CMIU, which is a bit more what they called bread and butter or Americanism, American-based organizing. The AFL had a rough connection with communities of color because they, for a long time, did not permit anybody who was an immigrant or Black to be a member of the union, especially at the turn of the century. And they had a rough relationship with women.
We're still there. Jim Crow, we're still there.
Yep. And so unions also saw women's labor or representing women initially, the turn of the century, as something that they didn't represent because they saw women who worked as taking away opportunity for men's labor. So the ideas of who should work and what that work looks like, all these things were contentious in the labor movement, just as they were contentious, much more broadly. But those things, right, they shift and they evolve over time. But when you're thinking about anti-fascism, the centralism of unionism and of labor and of workplaces being a form of organizing was definitely at the core during that period of time. And while I write about it in Florida, I mean, the important thing is that this is happening in New York City, right? There are massive organizations that happen at Madison Square Garden where there's this famous moment where people pour in and they fill that space, right? And they're singing No Pasaran together. By the same token, you have Black communities in Alabama. There is an amazing book written by a historian called Robin D.G. Kelly, which is called Hammer and Hoe. It is one of the most important studies, or the first and the most important studies of this movement. Robin D.G. Kelly, I mean, he's gone on to be a giant. He lives in California. He's good friends with Angela Davis. But he studied what this movement meant for Black communities. So it's things that are connecting nationally as well as internationally. And what's happening in Tampa is that it's part of a Caribbean connection, right? People who are organizing in Cuba. A good friend of mine named Ariel Lam wrote about the anti-fascist movement that happened on the island. Other historians, Catherine Marino has written about what was happening in Brazil, right? So all of these people are in connection and they're all talking together. They see themselves as part of that idea of what I said, a popular front or a people's front is what happens when people galvanize together in defense of a larger political goal because they're seeking democratic popular support. And when there isn't another front, so not a physical army necessarily that is going to restrict this, that people can do it through their collective voices. And in Tampa, people believed enough in this in the 1930s to where it wasn't unfathomable to have 5,000 to 7,000 people march from downtown Ybor to the front steps of City Hall. And those types of organizing moments were things that continued to happen through the 1930s. They happened every year, something to that effect. Wow. From that point on, right, while it was women only at the start, in part because of the way and who the Klan targeted for a long time, which was men. Right? Men were more likely to, at the time, experience physical violence, to experience lynching, to experience the wrath of the clan, and they had historically. Women were able to walk this middle zone in a different way, and they used that power the best way they could. Following 1937, you see mass protests in 38 and in 39, and those are no longer just women. They're community-wide. You have picnics that are including thousands of people where there are children there. You have children who are wearing bands on their arms that are illustrating that they are members of the Anti-Fascist Front as they're going to school at places like, Our Lady of Perpetual Health.
Wow.
Right?
What a time to be alive.
It was a
In Ybor City.
community-wide resistance. So one of the things that stands out to me during the 1930s is recognizing how fascism can happen as locally as before a mayor or before local or before a state congressperson, or even right at the national level, and people understanding the stakes that were there and what that meant, and being willing to resist it massively. Those moments are really difficult to reproduce.
You mentioned the phrase "no pasarán" earlier, and people that have traversed 7th Avenue may have come across a mural that our dear friend Michelle painted there on that wall. Can you tell us what that phrase indicates and what that means and what that mural is? Because it's a beautiful, beautiful depiction.
Absolutely. So "no pasarán," it literally translates to "they shall not pass." It was the galvanizing phrase of the Spanish Civil War and of the anti-fascist movement. And there's also a song, right, that went along with it, "No pasarán." Right? You can play the clip of it if you all want to hear it.
An
at
anthem.
some point.
It's an anthem.
It's an
sure.
anthem. Yeah. They would sing together. So "No pasarán," they shall not pass. This is what people said together in Spain, and it became a global galvanizing phrase as well. So if you are on 7th Avenue, one of the things that I wanted to do when the book came out is that I started to think about how can I translate the lessons of the book into a way that anyone can understand. Because when you walk through Ybor City, while you can see historical markers that may indicate that a fire station was here or that there was a bakery here, what you don't see are representations of the ideas, the politics, and the things that made the city come alive, that made people willing to fight for a particular form of work, and that also they were willing to sacrifice certain decisions later in life, right, in defense of those things. And in many ways, I would say that a lot of that has to do with the lack of coalition building that you see as you move into the 50s. I think there's some difficult decisions that the community makes. But the anti-fascist mural and marker, there's now a historical marker and a mural. It's the first project in Tampa that united the City of Tampa Arts and Culture with the Hillsborough County Historical Commission to tell a united story about what this is. So it is on the mural is on the side of the old CRA building. I'm probably going to mess it up, but I think the address is 2340. It's across from 7th and Grove. If you're familiar with the business, a great spot to go and check out, a Black-owned business down in 7th Avenue. And there is the historical marker that is standing next to it. You can see an image of the march on the back, and there is a description of the movement of the march and what it meant going forward. And those two things are there.
And there's 3 ladies depicted in the mural, correct?
There are 3
Do you know
women.
their names or anything about them? And as we come to the close of our show.
I know. Yeah, there are 3 women in it, and I'll keep it really short. So the 3 women they're representing the international, the national, and the local. Their images are represented. So the first woman, who is all the way in the back, she is the woman who galvanized the idea of no pasarán. She's from Spain. She was a member of the Republican government. She was democratically elected, and she was unseated, right, in the process of Franco's overtake of the country. The next woman down, she is a union organizer. Her name was Luisa Moreno. And, well, she comes to call herself Luisa Moreno from living in Florida. But she was a union organizer. She's the first woman union organizer for the Cigar Maker International Union in Tampa, which she was sent down to organize women because women were not joining the union when it was led by a man. And they did indeed join Moreno. when she led it. And she became an outspoken proponent of the Spanish Civil War to the extent that she ended up losing her job through the CMIU as a result of telling workers in Tampa not to take a disadvantageous agreement that she had met with different cigar manufacturers, and saying that she would not permit or that she wanted them to advocate for discussing politics at the AFL meeting that happened in Tampa in 1936. Tampa is actually where the American Federation of Labor, at that conference in 1936, where the American Federation of Labor and the Congress of Industrial Organizations split into two separate unions. So today that you know as the AFL-CIO, we're technically two separate. That splitting happened at the meeting that happened here in Tampa.
There's some history for you right there, ladies and gentlemen.
Yes, absolutely.
The
third lady?
The third lady on the front was the biggest surprise to me. So the third woman in the front, her name is Margot Falcon. And when Michelle was making the mural, she was just proposing a design at the time. She wrote me an email, and because I provided this full packet and any additional information that anybody, asked for, I sent them as well. Michelle wrote in and she asked me if I had a close-up image of anyone who was in the march. And I was like, oh God, like there's 7,000 people and, they're not individually identified. Like this is a tall order. But I did know two people. And I knew two people because my grandmother had told me about them. So I was introduced to this march because my grandmother clipped an image from the Tampa Tribune in 1991. And on her clipping, which she saved, she didn't show me till the early 2000s when I was about 16, she drew arrows pointing to two different women, one being my Aunt Margot and the other one being my Abuela Amelia, so her grandmother. And I had close-up photos of my Aunt Margot, who would have been a teenager at the time. Or she wasn't a teenager, I'm sorry, she was in her 20s at the time. And she was working in the cigar industry. And the front image, so is Margot Falcon. She is my great aunt. And she's representing the everyday person. Because while we think of histories as being about these big moments or these big people, what we forget is that you don't get a collective movement, or you don't get a civil rights movement, or you don't get an anti-fascist movement without the other 4,999 people willing to march behind the one person who you see as the spokesperson.
Yeah, absolutely.
But rarely do we remember those other thousands of people who made that possible.
And so now you have a different level of appreciation for Ybor City, as not just a place to go and get liquored up on the weekends or take a tour of a existing cigar factory museum, right? But you also now know that this was a hotbed of political activity, thanks to your workings, Sarah McNamara, and thanks to your research and all the efforts. Is there anything big around the corner coming for you that we need to know about? Have you won any awards for all of your hard work? In about 30 seconds.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the mural and marker on 7th Avenue, it just won the Best Placemaking Award from the Florida Historical Trust, right?
There's something right there. Yes, ma'am.
I mean, that's done well. The book has won a good amount of awards nationally. I don't know if you guys want
a good amount of awards. A good amount of awards.
I like the sound of that.
Well.
So this Ybor City Crucible of the Latina South, it's really an easy read too. It's not like, it's
a great book.
Not necessarily like one of Dr. McNamara's textbooks. I'm sure that's a little bit heavier. But this is very consumable.
Yeah, well, I was going to say I'm not saying this because I'm in front of her, because I think if you were not writing about history as an academician, if you just wanted to write prose or fiction, you probably would be just wonderful at it, because your writing style is easy to follow and it makes sense and it works and all of that. So
it took a long time to get it there, Joe. But it is there.
Yeah, and you're still on the road now. You're still working. You're still doing research right now.
I am. Yes, I'm working on the next project right now, figuring out what that will be.
When will you be in front of your students again?
Oh, too soon.
Probably.
I think in 28 days. My university, unfortunately, keeps posting that on Instagram.
Well, I think we mentioned at the beginning of the show that she's a professor at Texas
A&M,
Texas A&M, which means everybody who's listening, all of the stuff that she's doing here locally means she's flying back and forth between Texas and Florida and Texas and
back and forth
Florida.
a lot.
She has family here in Tampa. That's a lot.
Well, Joe, what's coming up next? Because we're just up against the hard out here in just a couple of seconds. Sarah, thank you so much.
No problem. Thank you all for having me.
Well, after following us is It's the Music, and I think Jim Bannon will be there. And
There he is. He's giving us a thumbs up. We can see him in the studio.
And then after Jim, we're going to, after It's the Music, we're going to be listening to Traffic Jam Wednesday with Nancy C. So we've got a great lineup for the rest of the day. Please stay on board.
Keep it right here. Thank you also to Jessica for working the board for us today, for DJ Spaceship for taking our call. And we like to say we're going to be here each and every week, so stay tuned. The Conversation Wednesdays at noon. You're listening to WMNF Tampa. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you all for having
Sarah.
me.
It's been a pleasure.